Can't hear me. Better? Stupid mic. Okay. So our panel today is on regional and international cooperation, realities, challenges, and prospects. I think yesterday we heard a lot about multilateral cooperation and kind of a pessimistic attitude. I'm hoping we'll have a little more optimism in the regional field. We've got 5 panelists. I'm going to ask each of them to be very, very brief, under 10 minutes, please, so that we have a little bit of time for actual discussion. And we are going to start with Matthew Borman, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Commerce in the United States for Export Administration. And he is responsible for implementing the Bureau of Industry and Security's controls on exports of dual-use items for national security, foreign policy, non-proliferation, and short supply reasons, which is a term I've not heard before. And so he also is responsible for programs such as the implementation of the Chemical Weapons Convention and the U.S. Additional Protocol. So I'm going to try to keep my reading of the bios brief. Hopefully you have these in your packets. And with that, I'll turn it over to Matthew.
Good. Thank you. Good morning to everyone. Can you hear me? No? Yes? Sort of? Yes. Let me come up a little more. How about now? I'll check. Alex, can you hear me? It doesn't look like you can. Jose, you guys can't hear me? It's on. It's got the green lights on. How about now? Because I have a lot of really important things to say, and I don't want anybody to listen. All right. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you to ORF for the invitation to be here. It's not often that the phrase export controls and optimism are linked together. But actually, interesting enough, hearing the discussion last night and this morning, there is very significant multilateral, not only cooperation, but agreement on export controls on a multilateral basis on space technology. Just a little bit of context for those of you who may not be as familiar with the export control world as the space world. There are 4 multilateral export control regimes. None of them are treaty-based. So they're all essentially agreements of some universe of supplier countries. And the 4 are the Wassenaar Arrangement, the Missile Technology Control Regime, the Nuclear Suppliers Group, and the Australia Group. The 2 that are relevant for space are the Wassenaar Arrangement and the Missile Technology Control Regime. I'll start with the MTCR, which is part of it, and the Wassenaar Arrangement, which is more of it. MTCR is a regime with 34 members. It was begun in 1987, and its goal is to stem the proliferation of delivery systems, unmanned delivery systems for weapons of mass destruction. So the part of the MTCR controls that are relevant to space are the controls on space launch vehicles. And now it's not an explicit control on space launch vehicles. It's control on unmanned delivery systems that can fly at least 300 kilometers with at least a 500-kilogram payload. So by definition, that includes space launch vehicles as well as ballistic missiles and larger unmanned aerial vehicles. As a little footnote, India is in the process of seeking MTCR membership. That process began roughly a year ago. So that's a little footnote here for India. And under the regime, members agree on what items should be controlled based on technical parameters. So the unmanned delivery vehicles are the primary but not the only piece. There are also controls on relevant subsystems, components, equipment, propellants, and materials. So all the members incorporate these control parameters into their own national export control regimes and then license the export of them on a national basis, ideally applying the guidelines of the regime, which is to stem the proliferation of these types of delivery systems. So you've got the MTCR controls on space launch vehicles. The Wassenaar Arrangement is really the functional equivalent to the old Coordinating Committee on Multilateral Export Controls, which was the trade equivalent of NATO. COCOM was designed to stem technology into the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. So it has a much broader mandate in terms of items covered, and it has a military list because it's focused on stemming the destabilizing accumulation of conventional arms and dual-use items related to those conventional arms. So it is a much broader scope than the MTCR, the NSG, or the AG. And the Wassenaar arrangement controls, also controls space launch vehicles, interestingly enough, but it also controls spacecraft. So just a few years ago, the Wassenaar members, there's 41 of them, agreed to add spacecraft and related parts and components to their list, liquid propulsion systems, solid propulsion systems, telemetry equipment, and the like, and then the software and technology related to the development and production of those items. So what I've just told you is actually actual multilateral agreement on controlling both the spacecraft, essentially, and the launch vehicles to put them in space, and the related ground equipment. Each member in Wassenaar, just like the MTCR, implements these controls through its own national export control system. An interesting sidelight in the United States is in 1999, the U.S. Congress decided that virtually all spacecraft and related parts and components should be treated as military items. Until the mid-90s, they were military items. In the mid-90s, in the Clinton administration, commercial communication satellites and related parts and components were moved from the State Department's export licensing jurisdiction as military items to the Commerce Department's export licensing jurisdiction as dual-use items. But as a result of some technology that was divulged in the review of some launch failures, satellites on a Chinese launch vehicle, the Long March, in the late 90s, Congress decided to put them back on the USML, where they stayed for the better part of the first decade of, more than the first decade of the 2000s. Congress 3 years ago gave the president authority to move them back to the Commerce list. And last year we implemented that authority. So virtually all spacecraft, commercial spacecraft and related items are under Commerce Department export licensing jurisdiction. So that creates, frankly, a huge resurgence of an opportunity for U.S. suppliers to foreign satellite manufacturers, because they're commerce items, which means they're treated less restrictively than if they were USML munitions items. Just give you a couple statistics, and then we'll move on to other panelists. Last year, in fiscal year 15, which for us runs from October 1st, 2014 to September 30, 2015, we at Commerce licensed the export of about 700 spacecraft-related exports around the world, worth about $5.5 billion. Now, that's what we licensed. What actually gets exported typically is about half of that by dollar value, but that's what we authorized U.S. companies to export. So that's a fairly robust trade between the United States and the rest of the world for spacecraft and related parts and components. And most of those exports were for satellite parts and components, BOF sets, ASICs, FPGAs, those kinds of electronic components. We had 36 denials, and while I didn't look at the details of the denials, my guess is most of those denials were for Russian programs because of the Russian annexation of Crimea and the destabilization in eastern Ukraine. We have taken a very strict position on items that could benefit the Russian military. And the cut line we've made from a licensing policy for space is that anything going to a sort of Russian domestic space program we are not going to approve, because there's no way to ensure that that space program will only be used for civilian purposes. But if it's for some international cooperative program that the Russians are involved in, we continue to approve those, like the space station, the International Space Station, for example. And those denials were worth about $10 million. So let me wrap up by saying again, on the technology transfer piece of space, there are multilateral controls that are already in place. One caveat, of course, is not all supplying countries are members of the regimes. For example, India is not a member of the Wassenaar Arrangement, although India has said it wants to become a member. China is not a member of the Wassenaar Arrangement. But basically, all the European Union is the US, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and Russia. So it's not universal, it's not treaty-based, but it's essentially an agreement among most of the suppliers. And it's a fairly robust trade in terms of US exports in the commercial space area. So let me maybe stop at that point, Teresa, and turn it back over to you. Yeah, hold it down.
Thank you. Matthew. I appreciate that. That was interesting, and I think it's really important because it does the changeover from the military list to the commercial list. It's changing the game a little bit in the U.S. and what's happening in the commercial space field. Next on deck we have Bruno Hanses, who is the senior expert on non-proliferation, disarmament, and arms control at the European External Action Service in Brussels. He's had a long career with the EU in the area of common foreign and security policy, and one of his previous positions was the head of the section on disarmament and non-proliferation in the EU delegation in Geneva, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about the international and multilateral context.
Thank you. I go there. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you also to the ORF and in particular to Raji for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be with you. I have a daunting task today, namely to install some optimism here and to make the case for principles of responsible behavior in outer space. Next slide. Are you doing this or should I? Okay. So I will go back a bit into history, but not so much. Present to you the current draft of the International Code of Conduct on the process, draw some lessons learned, and especially on the next steps. I will do that very quickly because this PowerPoint presentation will be circulated afterwards, so there's no need to sort of go into much detail. You can all read this afterwards at home. Basically, the whole process started in 2007 in response to a call by the UN Secretary General for TCBMs. It's a voluntary, non-legally binding document, and it was presented to the international community in Vienna in June 2012. As I said, the purpose and the scope of the ICOC is to address broader issues of safety, security and sustainability in outer space, and to establish TCBMs and complement the international legal framework. I have now a couple of slides where I go into the draft, what it all says, but I think I can do this very quickly. Basically, there's a kind of overlap in a bit with the COPWAS, but you can also call it a complementarity. There is the notion of notification of outer space activities, that those who subscribe to the code, they inform each other. I go very quickly. There's information and a cooperation mechanism on outer space activities, consultation mechanism. There are organizational aspects, especially there's an annual meeting of subscribing states to discuss things, and the appointment also of central points of contacts. You can read quietly the draft code when you look at our website, www.eeas, which stands for European External Action Service, .eu. There you find in the section on non-proliferation and disarmament the full text of the code as it stands. Now, what is maybe more interesting is the process, because we had, it sort of comes from the United Nations. As I said, there was also a report of the group of governmental experts. The UN General Assembly sort of endorsed this report. The code is mentioned there as one of the possibilities to implement these GGE recommendations. We had a number of open consultations. We finally had a meeting in New York in July last year where a lot of states participated. We had there, under the very wise leadership of Professor Marchisio, who is also here with us, we had very substantive discussions on the content, on the process. But we cannot really say that there were negotiations. I think it run into a lot of difficulties. But the outcome is there. It's a chairman's summary, and that is basically where things stand with regard to the EU proposal for the International Code of Conduct. Now, believe it or not, we have learned some lessons from this. The European Union has listened carefully to the comments made, and we think that the draft proposal for an International Code of Conduct is still a valuable document, so we should maintain basically the destination, but that is the International Code of Conduct, but we would consider changing the vehicle and the working methods on how to get there. Basically, we think that seen from today, maybe one should concentrate on some basic principles, where we hope that they would also find traction with the wider international community. And these principles are basically, but maybe not exclusively, these are just initial proposals, the idea that, of course, the reaffirmation, rather, that space is for all mankind. I think that is quite obvious. There is also the need to avoid debris creation, refrain from harmful interference. We just heard the presentation on interference. There's also, very importantly, the notion of cooperation among states. That is to say, spacefaring nations and those who aspire to become spacefaring nations. I think that is quite important because we want to avoid creating, let's say, a club of the haves against the have-nots. So there's this notion of cooperation is there. And all in all, we need, of course, greater transparency. For instance, notifications of critical events and so on. So these are our basic ideas. We also think that we need to build a broad and genuine cross-regional support. I think this is very important because the process which we have seen so far with the International Code of Conduct, it sometimes suffered from the fact that there was not really a strong, despite all our consultations, a genuine cross-regional support. So I think we need to get on board countries also for example, in Latin America, countries in Africa, and of course, absolutely indispensable, broader support also in Asia. So altogether, we need to increase the global ownership. We cannot do that very quickly. It will be a process. So therefore, we envisage a timeline, not this year at the UN General Assembly, but rather in 2017, when we have the 22nd UN General Assembly. So the next steps would be, I think we should get together in a group which we would like to call an open-ended group of friends, because you always have this phenomenon, socio-psychological phenomenon with groups, that you have those who are in the group and they define themselves against those who are outside the group. So here from the beginning, we want to make sure that this group is kind of open-ended. Everybody who wants to participate in the process is most welcome. We will use 2016 all opportunities, including this space dialogue here in Delhi, for bilateral and multilateral consultations, especially also in the international fora in New York, Geneva, Vienna, but also elsewhere. And then we hope that we will come up with more consolidated views in time for the 22nd session of the UN General Assembly. So this is a broad outline how we see the process, and which sort of, contradicts a bit the idea that the code is dead. The code is not dead. It's put a bit into parenthesis, and we will work on principles of responsible behavior with a view to create, let's say, the ground for future successful negotiations on an international code of conduct. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bruno. Glad to hear that you're optimistic. Next on our panel, we have Brett Biddington, who is the owner of a consulting company specializing in space and cybersecurity. He's also leading a team that's working on having a successful outcome of the International Astronautical Congress in 2017 in Adelaide. He's a former member of Cisco Systems Global Space Team and also former Royal Australian Air Force officer. Also interesting to this panel, he is the director of the Institute for Regional Security, which is a think tank based in Canberra, and also of the Space Environment Research Cooperative Research Center. Over to you, Brett.
Thank you, Teresa, and ladies and gentlemen, great pleasure to be here, and to Raji and the Observer Research Foundation, thank you for the invitation. I thought I'd mention a few words to begin with about Kalpana Chawla. She died, as we know, with 6 of her colleagues in the Columbia space disaster, shuttle disaster, some years ago. But there was an Australian experiment on that, on the shuttle. The Spiders in Space experiment was one of 6 that was selected from school students around the world. They were doing things with spiders, silkworms, inorganic crystals, fish, bees, and ants. All of those perished as well, but the important thing was, and this is a point of connection that is still maintained, I'm told, the Australian experiment was sending data back as the data was being gathered. So we do know a little bit from that disaster about how spiders do or don't make webs in space. Let me keep going. I want to talk primarily about middle powers and what their role might be in terms of regional cooperation in space, and I've been asked to look particularly or make some remarks particularly about what is happening with regards to regional cooperation in the Asia Pacific. Firstly, it seems to me we need to think about some sort of hierarchy, and there are all sorts of hierarchies. Those countries in blue are representative of the sorts of countries that I'm interested in. Basically, those countries in the G20 that might be in the second 10, not the first 10. Trust and cooperation is really underpinning the sorts of things that we do with regards to working together against common problems. There are organisations, and I'll come to this shortly, where there is cooperation around projects. Let's find out what the impact is of the Indonesians cutting down forests in Borneo, Kalimantan, in order to basically have better agriculture, or more land for agriculture. Common good projects, they're pretty small, modest commitments, and if they fail, it doesn't really matter. Life will go on. It might go on not as well as we would have hoped. On the other hand, at the national security end of this scale, we have much broader and bigger and serious questions to talk about, and failure perhaps is not an option. And somewhere in that continuum, we need to think about where we do regional cooperation. So 2 broad models. The one on the far side from me is basically the way that is in Asia today. Major space power A would be China, and it has around it a grouping called APSCO, and that was formed in response to major regional space power B, Japan, building around itself a group of friendly countries and well-disposed countries, and that's APROSAF. And they do the sorts of low-risk projects, particularly APROSAF, that produce common benefit, produce places where people meet annually, that's good, but potentially not talking about the more serious national security issues. For me, the challenge is how to build a network of medium states and to think what they might do in concert, some more closely related than others, and that's the idea of the thicker lines and the thinner lines, without necessarily having a major space power involved, at least not in the first instance. So those countries in the network all have vital interests in secure and assured access to space, as we all know, but the question is, how do they then aggregate those common interests and then express those interests in a way that have some reasonable influence within the international system? I then talk briefly about disruptive technologies, because I think that we are a bit obsessed in this room about space. The fact of the matter is, if we weren't, we wouldn't be here. But also, there are things happening that I think begin to challenge us to think about the language we use, to think about the sorts of constituencies that we involve in this discussion going forward. We've had the conversation about the relationship, absolute relationship, between cybersecurity and space security. I don't need to go there any further. We've had the discussion around the dependence of essentially the global economy on GNSS. I don't need to go there anymore. But we haven't talked much about drones. In my judgment, and I just look at my own government, which is investing in high-end, medium-size and low-end drones, let alone what's happening in the commercial and civil place, my suspicion is that governments and companies will very quickly move to owning their own drones to do a lot of things that presently we depend on satellites for, because we're sort of lazy and satellites are there and we know about them and they provide the data. But we don't own those satellites. You do own the drone, and therefore you can monetize the data from that drone and use it and add it to pools of data that then allow information to be extracted through big data analytics. Some are in there, I think, as a transformational vector, and this might, in fact, start to reduce some of the pressure that we have been talking about on the space domain, because maybe that space marketplace becomes less cluttered as the airspace for drones becomes more cluttered. Miniaturization, of course, is the other piece that we need to deal with, and we've talked about that in the context of small satellite constellations and the risks that they present to the conventional operators. Two quick case studies. The search for MH370. You might recall that within 24 hours of the plane disappearing, the Chinese said they'd seen data from one of their satellites in the South China Sea. It became a bit of a competition to see who could find MH370. Where's Wally? That sort of idea in the very first few hours and days of this dreadful event. As time went on, of course, we did realise that the plane was somewhere at the bottom end of the Indian Ocean. That meant that it was an Australian responsibility in terms of search and rescue response and coordination. We had a very difficult situation because there were so many people and so many assets put into the place at the same time. Potentially there were going to be collisions between aircraft, and so a former chief of our Defence Force was brought in to try to do some military diplomacy and just deconflict a lot of people who all wanted to help all at the one time. The one point I want to make from this is that our Prime Minister of the day, Tony Abbott, went to Perth in Western Australia in April of last year to thank the men and women who'd looked for the plane. And he got a briefing from our imagery community about how data from Italy, data from classified systems, data from unclassified US systems, data from various nations had been used in the search. And then the Prime Minister looked at this official and said, and what about the Australian satellites? Now, shame on us, because we had not explained to the Prime Minister that we don't own any Earth observation satellites of our own. The point I want to make, and there are two sort of sub-elements of this. One is, I suspect that Prime Minister Abbott is not the only politician in the world who is aware or not aware of what his or her country does or does not have in the way of space hardware. So there's a real problem here of of official understanding and political understanding of what we do and don't have as nations. The second point is that because Australia has no assets of its own in space for Earth observation, it took some days to get release of data from some of the countries that wanted to help. Had there been life rafts on the water, that meant that there would have been people who could have been saved who would not have been. So the point is, you don't need necessarily to have skin in the game in order to simply have more eyes on the target. Frankly, a satellite with a kangaroo on the side wouldn't have made a damn difference in that particular situation of finding MH370. But because we didn't have our own Earth observation satellites, because we didn't have agreements in place, there was delay. So there are some stories in here and some lessons in here that I think are worth passing on. My second case study is actually why we're here today. We're beginning to see 4 nations start to collaborate in a whole lot of domains, including the space domain, because of our concerns about China. Put yourself now, as an audience, in the mind of Beijing. What in the hell does this look like? We've heard of the sort of concerns, the paranoia of the leadership in Beijing. That sort of map and this sort of behaviour can only increase that level of paranoia. And the question is then, in terms of this higher level cooperation that is beginning to happen, we need to think pretty carefully about the implications from the other side. So some future prospects. Firstly, and we've heard about this, resetting the conversation for the ICOC. I wonder if we might start to think about how the United Nations went about the law of the sea. There was a group, the dispossessed landlocked nations, nothing much in common other than they were landlocked. Bolivia and Switzerland come to mind, yet they became the blocking third. They couldn't make initiatives, but they could stop initiatives within the Law of the Sea Conference. Perhaps there are some nations that could begin to think about behaving in similar ways, space-dependent but not spacefaring. I wonder, therefore, if there might be an opportunity for MICTA, which is a really interesting grouping of 5 nations, Mexico, Indonesia, South Korea, Turkey and Australia. Maybe the Commonwealth of Nations in some sort of rebadged group. Non-traditional spacefaring groupings starting to think about their individual national interests, their collective regional and indeed broader international interests, to begin a conversation that could potentially, just potentially, start to change the language and shift some understandings. And as I said before, educating our leaders, quiet diplomacy. We did have a Prime Minister who promised to shirt front Vladimir Putin at one point. That's not the way to do diplomacy. Shirt fronting, for those who don't know, is what happens in Australian rules football when you both go up to try to catch the ball together, but one person doesn't worry about the ball, he just smacks into the other one and lays him on the ground, then gets the ball and kicks the goal. So that was the idea of our Prime Minister with regard to President Putin a couple of years ago. We need to not do that. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brett. That was quite interesting, especially the mixed tech thing, which I hope somebody comes back to for questions. Next, we have Kazuda Suzuki, who is a professor of at the Public Policy School at Hokkaido University. And before moving back to Japan, he worked for the panel of experts on Iran sanctions at the United Nations from 2013 to 2015. He has been an advisor for the Space Development Committee of the Liberal Democratic Party of Japan and for the Society of Japanese Aerospace Companies, as well as a senior policy researcher for the Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency. And it's not in this bio, but Kazuda also was the chairperson of the World Economic Forum's Global Committee on Space Issues for the last couple of years.
Well, thank you, Teresa, and thank you, ORF, for inviting me, and especially I give a big applause for Raji to manage and set up such a very, very interesting workshop commemorating Mr. Owada. So it's always hard to follow what Brett said. I mean, I'm a bit nervous because I'm not a good talker as a Brett. But I think what I'm going to talk about are a little bit overlapping with what Brett has already discussed, but in a different perspective. I'm a political scientist. I've been working on the international cooperation in space. And I think China has been always the sort of, the name of the game today and yesterday even. But the point is that none of the Asian countries are sharing the sort of a place in the space for a long time. I mean, in the history of space, United States and Soviet Union has been the sort of a superpowers, and even Japan, China, and India are the emerging powers. And there are some understanding particularly among American audience, but also elsewhere, that there is a rivalry between Japan, China, and India, and which drives their space programs. Some of them are true, but not always, because the target or the idea for investing in space has quite different among these three countries. In short, they are not playing the same game. And also, I think one of the things that we need to be aware is that none of the Asian countries are the global powers yet. Yes, China has an ambition to be a global power, but still their actual interest is in their core territory, which includes the South China Sea and East China Sea, and somewhat related to the annexed territories. But the Chinese are not playing as a global power yet. They have a very limited power projection capabilities, and they are now developing the space capabilities, but not as the sort of an byproduct of their global ambition, again, yet. So, and so has Japan. Japan doesn't have this territorial and global ambitions to access and exercising its military forces outside the territory. So again, the use of space has quite different as what the United States and Soviet Union did, and so was India. So basically, space capability, particularly driven by the military objective, has not applied to the Japan, China, and India, and to the later stage of the history of the space development. So this is the sort of a starting point that I'm going to discuss. So APRSAF, APUSCO, the Brett has clearly, I mean, he used a much nicer scheme to explain that. The APRSAF stands for the Asia Pacific Regional Space Agency Forum, which is basically the space policy forums, the space agency forum. So it's among space agencies, and it's a talking shop. Basically, it doesn't have any concrete programs. Although there are, in the bottom, there are programs such as Sentinel Asia in 2005, SAFE program in 2008, and STAR program in 2009. But none of those have made a significant step afterwards. So the APRSAF, as a response to the emergence of the APUSCO, the Asia Pacific Space Cooperation Organization, which is led by China, these programs were basically a response to the Chinese sort of an ambition to use the APUSCO for gaining a leadership in Asian regions and providing a technology to make sure that they can expand their market. Nevertheless, the APUSCO has not yet been a very, very progressive as well. There are two small satellite programs launched by the APUSCO framework, but the last one is 2012, and since then they are very, very limited and a slowing down of the interest from Chinese parts to invest in APUSCO. So both APRSAF and APUSCO were created as the rivalry of let's say competition of the leadership in Asia among these two countries, but not really gaining the sort of achieving their objective in the last couple of years. The reason why is that there are certain direct, a shift of the space policies among these countries. Japan, since 2008, the basic space law has launched, and then the idea was to transform the Japanese space policy from, the technology-oriented one to the geostrategic-oriented one. And this is one of the reason why there are so many activities took place in APRSAF, which is led by JAXA. But again, there are much more focus on the national program rather than the international program, and Japan is using the space for the geostrategic purposes, so it's not going through the channel of APRSAF, which are led by JAXA, which is the Science and Technology Civilian Agency, but through the channels of the foreign policy and the strategic policy realm, including the National Security Council. China, for many years, the Chinese space program in general were characterized as a catching up, and catching up with what United States and Soviet Union has achieved, and all of which are now ongoing. And now China is stepping forward to earn a global leadership. But the most important issue of the day in China is the modernization of the military. So increasing the military capability for through developing the space infrastructure is one of the main concerns for China today. And India, I don't think that's necessary to discuss with you, but I mean, already, more than I do. The space has been shifting from the more sociological, socio-economic purposes to more strategic issues. The challenges in Asia is that there are overlapping organizations. The closed system, APUSCO. APUSCO is more like an ESA-like treaty-based organization, whereas the APRSAF is an open forum. So these two organizations are not really overlapping. So it can be, China is a member of the APRSAF, although they don't participate in the APRSAF meeting, and Japan is not a member of APUSCO. Member of APUSCO is pretty much of the fourth tier of what Brett has discussed, including Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Iran. One of the interesting development of the last couple of years is that there is a competing strategic goal between Japan and China for taking a leadership through these framework, and both are not being successful. And the larger reason behind it is the overall bilateral relationship with the United States has changed because of the China-US after the 2007 ASA test. From Chinese perspective, what they do in the space program is that they are following the footsteps of what the United States did, but from United States point of view, it's been challenged. And from the Japanese point of view, because of the emergence of China in the security realm, Japan is trying to attract more United States to defend Japan because of its pacifist constitutions. So therefore, the strengthening the alliance with United States is important, and space is used as the sort of one key domain for the strategic alliance, to strengthen the alliance strategically. And India and US also very interesting because there is a potential for cooperation, but there are many barriers and which are not successful. The game changers in Asia are 2 points. One is the emergence and increasing development of the commercialization of space, which leads to the third and fourth tier countries in the Brett's framework, Brett's pyramid. The third and fourth tier countries can access to the space technology not through Japan or China, but through the commercial market. So they don't have to go into these international schemes, and they can gain their capabilities through the commercial market. The second issue is that there are too much of the territorial dispute among Asian countries, and the use of space, the importance of space is increasing as the strategic issue. For many years, space in Asia was the technology, science, and commercial civil issues. But the Japan, China is now looking at space more and more as a strategic tools, and which are very difficult for both Japan and China to share with other countries. And finally, one of the interesting part is that neither Japan nor China is very big player in the commercial market, so that they cannot perform their leadership role for the second, third, and fourth tier countries through the commercial market. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that was a very interesting point on the role or potential role of the commercial market to be a game changer in the geostrategic situation in the region. I think that's quite interesting and something I hadn't heard before, so thanks, Kazuto. Next we have Ajay Lele, who's the Assistant Director of the Institute of Defense Studies and Analyses here in New Delhi. He specializes on issues related to weapons of mass destruction with an emphasis on biological weapons, very interesting, space and national security, and non-military threats. He's also the author of a recent book called The Asian Space Race, Rhetoric or Reality. So I take it that maybe that's what you'll be talking about. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Well, in the line of order, thank you, Chair. Thank you, ORF. Thank you, Raji. Just to put the things in context, like Chair started, whether I'm an optimist or a pessimist, it just reminded me that just 2 days back, NASA has released an audio of the Apollo 10s which they have heard. So I'm not going to be either optimist or a pessimist, but I think what I'm going to essentially discuss is interference. The task which has been given by Raji to me is to put in context, in a very limited sense, of issues related to India and SAARC. Since this being an international audience, let me just put in perspective what SAARC is all about. It is a group of 8 countries which are in the South Asian region. You all can see the names of the countries. I'll not dwell much time on it. SAARC got established around more than 3 decades back. Essentially, like any multilateral organization, the key focus of this organization is economics and other aspects of social change. So it's essentially looking at welfare economics. Should I say that SAARC has succeeded? Definitely not, but yes, there are a few positives also. SAARC is facing a lot of challenges, right from terrorism to natural disasters. There are a few ground realities. Just to put in context the region of South Asia, that South Asia is very difficult as far as terrain and topography is concerned. You got ranges of Himalayas, you got huge water bodies like Ganges, Indus, which are as huge as a small sea. Then there is a huge amount of a desert area. You encounter a lot of changing weather patterns. Essentially because of that, there is an incremental happenings in natural disasters also. SAARC covers only 3% of the world's area, but it almost covers 1/4 of the global population. And more importantly, the business which is done in SAARC is 1/10 of what is happening in the world. So it might be a very smaller region geographically, but otherwise it's a very major region. And not to forget that there are 2 nuclear power states which are residing in SAARC region. What is the relevance of a SAARC? I think that it is politically charged body of countries. In spite of its limitations, it has got certain amount of importance. There are countries, the big countries, which are interested into the working of SAARC, hence they have asked for an observer status. So you can see there are states like United States, Australia, Japan and China who are having an observer status in SAARC. Myanmar is very keen to join SAARC because of their geographical proximity to India. There have been few areas of cooperation as far as SAARC is concerned. It has been in the areas of environment, energy, education, science and technology and media. I will only focus on issues related to science and technology. There is one very key element of a SAARC which has been evolved more than 2 decades back, where good amount of interaction is happening in the meteorological research arena, where the data sharing is happening. Now, why space technology is important for SAARC? Space technology, I don't have to tell to this audience the importance of it, but from SAARC point of view, there are various critical issues. Particularly, it is a very different mix of land and water resources. So definitely you are interested into space technologies and the associated applications like GIS to understand and locate your land resource, water management issues and other issues. SAARC is again becoming a very developed region in a sense. So naturally other issues related to communication and navigation are important. For SAARC, telemedicine and education has been the key area where the space has been having a major focus. Disaster management, you all have witnessed what is happening in Fiji as of yesterday. So definitely SAARC has also been embroiled because of various natural disasters, hence the space is important. Now what is the footprint of this space in SAARC? Unfortunately, amongst the 8 countries, there is only one country, that is India, which is a space-faring nation in SAARC. It has been doing pretty well, a tier 2 sort of a power into the world vis-a-vis space. It has launched its first satellite into 75 and became a space-faring nation in 1980. Pakistan has got limited capabilities. They have been into this business for quite some time, but the capabilities have been limited. Bangladesh is making their requirements pretty open now to the rest of the world. They are also understanding that particularly owing to various natural disasters, they need to depend on space in coming days much and more. Sri Lanka is also playing a very important role as far as developing their space infrastructure. They are following a model more amount for initial development at least happening in private arenas. Other smaller countries are also looking at space from a positive perspective. Just to put it into numbers, India has so far launched 81 satellites, 74 have been successful. As far as Pakistan is concerned, the second SAARC nation vis-a-vis the numbers, if one has to compare, it has launched only 5 satellites, and that too by taking the help of the other people. So from that perspective, India becomes obviously the most dominant player in SAARC in the space arena. Now the question which one needs to ask is, collectively SAARC have addressed the issue of a space pretty well? My answer is a very small yes and a big no. Combined space vision. Now what happens is that when you're looking at a space from a geostrategic and geopolitical perspective, one has to understand that a country needs to have a political leadership which allows to invest into the space arena. So what happens is that whether the countries in the region have got certain amount of investments made in science and technology, where there is a political willingness, where scientific and economic capabilities are allowing those countries to make investments into a space. What is the role of an international collaboration? There are various issues which essentially could give you answers that how SAARC countries have made investments into space. Now what I can see is that the countries are very small in the region. They are trying to find their own feet right now, and they are not going to make major investments into space barring 1 or 2 countries. The only thing which I am slightly surprised is about Pakistan's capabilities. Pakistan has got huge amount of capabilities as far as their missile and nuclear arenas are concerned. So they could have done pretty well into the space arena, but maybe their political leadership and military leadership never envisaged that space could emerge as a very major power in years to come. Now, if I am looking at SAARC, there has been much of a talk that there is going to be a SAARC satellite. So this is the one initiative under SAARC rubric which one can say has been taking shape for quite some time now. The idea was booted by Indian scientists almost 2 decades back when SAARC was celebrating its first decade of existence, the 10th anniversary. So in 1995, this idea was proposed by Indian scientists. There was a seminar which was held about SAARC 2000 and beyond. The idea was discussed threadbare, but subsequently nothing much has happened as far as SAARC satellite has been concerned. Now, what could be the reasons for it? The purpose was very clear that you require a satellite for all known purposes or for all known reasons. The proposal of SAARC satellite was discussed in Dhaka also 3 years after it was mooted by Indian scientists. But it appears that because of India-Pakistan problem, this thing could never take a shape. Now, just last year or last year, Indian Prime Minister in 2014 have announced that they are interested again to push this idea of a SAARC satellite, and this time India appears to be pretty determined about it. Now, India is making an argument that understanding the complexities and the interstate relationship between the region, the best option for India is to gift a satellite to SAARC. Most of the countries have really welcomed this idea that a satellite is being gifted to them and it will cater for essentially their communication requirements. But there is certain amount of complexities which I can say as far as Pakistan is concerned, because they have raised certain amount of security and mission scope issues. But I think these issues over the period of a time will slightly water down. There have been indication given by ISRO chief that Pakistan is almost coming on board, and now India has taken a decision that on 6th of December, that is the SAARC day in 2016, India will launch this satellite. Now, what this satellite is about? It's a small satellite of 2000 kg weight. Its basic function is to make investments and make countries in the SAARC aware and give them the benefits of teleeducation, telemedicine and communication during disasters. Now, India is trying to look not only as a SAARC satellite as an option for the bilateral or a multilateral collaboration into the SAARC region. India is evolving its own regional navigation system, and if you can see the swath of this system, all SAARC countries are falling into that. So India need not to do anything additional over here, but they just have to make the signal available to the SAARC countries also, and that's what India is proposing to do. Now let me go to the core subject which has been given to me about SAARC and space multilateralism. Regional mechanisms, one has to make a statement over here that as far as regional mechanisms are concerned, they started evolving say in 60s, 70s and 80s. At that point in time, space was not that a hot subject. States were continuously evolving in the process of space arena. So if you look at major multilateral negotiations which have happened over the years where countries have joined hands together, space is finding some place, but that was under the rubric of a science and technology, a subset of a science and technology. Now, over a period of time, people have started understanding that space has got a very dominant importance as far as the socio-economic development as well as the strategic development of the nation states are concerned, and from that perspective now people are looking at space differently. There are a few global groupings which have been there. ASEAN member states are having their own groupings. Particularly all ASEAN states, recently President Obama has looked at ASEAN states. They are non-spacefaring states, but there are a few other states which are ASEAN +3, which are spacefaring states. As far as SAARC is concerned, I think India is the only player. Shanghai Cooperation Organization, there are many SAARC players which are there. SAARC players have been part of various UN groupings. Like my previous speaker has spoken about the regional organizations, there is an organization, Asia Pacific Space Cooperation Organization. Interestingly, this organization is usually dominated by China, and both the countries like spacefaring nations like India and Japan are not there. Then there is other grouping, the talk shop which was told by my previous speaker is there. What are the actualities in SAARC? South Asia is a very complex area. India has launched 55 satellites to other countries, but none of them for the SAARC. Bangladesh is making a certain amount of investments into developing satellites. China is almost, I am using a word from the maritime thing, that string of pearls. China is almost making investments into all the countries vis-a-vis satellites are concerned. Due to paucity of time, I will not get into the details of it. What is the future? I think SAARC needs a roadmap as far as space is concerned. India should not limit itself to SAARC satellite, need to make more investments. So in the end, what I will say is that being only spacefaring nation into the region, India becomes some sort of a island of a prosperity. But India should not carry with a big brother attitude and should engage constructively other SAARC nations. India could do many things over here. Particularly India and Pakistan need to learn from the US-Russia relationship. They don't have the problems which are there on the ground into the space, and there's much to learn from that. In the end, I will say that space could play an important role towards sustainable development into the region. Thank you.
Okay, at this point we have about 15 minutes for question and answer. So if you could raise your hand, wait for the mic, and identify yourself. I'm going to take 2 or 3 questions at a time. Sarah, you and then you. Okay. Start here.
Teresa, and thanks to all the panelists for the excellent presentations. I'm Cesar Jaramillo. I'm the Executive Director of Project Plowshares in Canada. I have a brief comment and a question both for Bruno Hanses about the European, the International Code of Conduct proposal. The comment is, I realize that the code is often described as a non-binding proposal, but I would suggest that perhaps a more appropriate description would be politically binding proposal. And it's whatever nations choose to adopt the code are making a well-publicized international commitment, a political commitment. So even if it is not technically a treaty and it's not legally binding, I would say that it is still binding from a political perspective, and that's something to keep in mind. The question relates to first a point of clarification. It wasn't entirely clear to me what's the expectation for the UN General Assembly in 2017. Is it for the code to be adopted, or that wasn't entirely clear to me, so if you could please clarify that point. But the main question is, how would you define success going forward in terms of the code and in terms of a critical mass of nations that adopt the code? I mean, is it successful if the US, China, Russia, India are all in? Would it still be successful if at least one of these major space powers are not in or have not adopted the code? So again, how would you define success going forward? Thank you.
And we had a question here in
My name is Professor Murthy. I formerly worked in ISRO. This is a question about international cooperation. One of the issues which is of current interest is the issue of private sector role in the resource exploitation from space. There have been legislative initiatives in the United States of late, and this is an issue which is of interest worldwide. This was not touched upon by any of the members. So what do we foresee as possible cooperation that can develop in this field? Because this is one of the areas which could be of interest to the commercial players all over the world, and also for the governments. The second comment is about the regional cooperation. Essentially, Mr. Suzuki mentioned about two organizations, so also Ajay. There are APSCO and Asia Pacific Regional Space Agency Forum. But there was also another initiative from India, and of course with participation of large number of regional players, regional countries. This is the Asia Pacific Center for Space Science, Technology and Education. This is a different way of leadership that was taken by India for capacity building in this region. I think this is also another initiative which has gone a long way, and for over nearly 1.5 decades, it was very successful in bringing a lot of cooperation in the region in the field of capacity building in the field for space science, technology and applications.
And we had one in the back over here on this side, the gentleman with his hand up, and then we'll go to the panel. Did you get
My first question to Matthew is that you have talked about the US exports of 2.5.
Turn it up, turn it on.
We can't hear you.
Okay. My question to Matthew is that you have talked about $2.5 billion exports. Can you explain the specifics where the US is exporting its space applications? And other thing is that Ajay Lile sir, you have talked about the India's but why is there any possibility of cooperation between the space nations in like Pakistan and Sri Lanka on the space application part, if not on the satellites?
Thank you. I think you had the first direct question directed to you, so why don't you start with that?
Yeah, thank you. I think about maybe two questions. What is the measure of success and what will happen next year?
Not audible.
Yes, I think there were two questions. One is what will happen next year at the UNGA and what is the measure of success? Now, it's maybe a bit difficult to predict what will happen next year for me, but let's say our intention would be to work towards you know, a fairly large measure of support for a resolution, and where those who you know, subscribe to it and the UN General Assembly would sort of pledge you know, a number of commitments, again, political commitments, but compared to the original draft of the International Code of Conduct, it would be very simple and let's say easy to understand principles. As I mentioned, avoid debris creation, you know, greater transparency, more cooperation between states, avoid interference, and reaffirm that space is for all mankind. You know? So something fairly simple, where we hope that we sort of find traction with a large number of countries, and that maybe also answers then the second question. So if you would come to that point, I think we would see it as a success, and hope from today's perspective that this will open, let's say, clear the way or clear the atmosphere for future negotiations on a draft code of conduct, which could be a bit more explicit, a bit more detailed on some aspects. Thank you.
So, to answer the question about where did the U.S. exports go to? Not surprisingly, the most significant chunk by dollar value went to Europe, to individual companies and entities, at least 220 million last year, roughly 50 million at least to Japan, and there was about 82 million that was licensed to India, but actual exports last year to India in this area were only about $4 million. So it's, you know, it's where you would expect. It's the countries that are building satellites, essentially.
2-3 points out of the discussion. One is about what CG says about politically binding code of conduct issues. I think that's the basic reason why out of so many deliberations the code of conduct is not going anywhere, at least at this point in time. Then the role of private sector, which has been talked about, I entirely agree that there will be an increasing role for the private sector. But recently Obama has signed a document where it is allowing the private sector to keep the stuff which they will pick up from asteroids. So it is slightly a controversial signature on the document. So people are slightly confused about what could be the role of a private sector in that sense. That means if as a private entity, if I can reach to the moon, if I can reach to the Mars first, then whatever stuff which I will get over there, I can keep it or I can sell it also. So people have got certain amount of reservations, but otherwise the way private sector is evolving, I am 100% sure that the private sector is going to be the basic driver for tomorrow. Then there was an issue about Pakistan-Sri Lanka collaboration. I think right now Sri Lanka is doing good collaboration, particularly with China. China's Great Wall industry is helping Sri Lanka to develop not only its space program, but it is developing a sort of an academy over there to train people, to train scientists, to develop ground infrastructure. The first satellite for Sri Lanka also was launched by China as a private venture. So essentially right now, there is no linkage which I can find as far as Pakistan and Sri Lanka are concerned. Essentially it's China and Sri Lanka that's happening.
We have 4 minutes. I'll take one more brief question.
Hi, Daniel Porras for LMI Advisors. There's been a lot of talk of competitiveness with China. I'm just curious, in the regional aspect, are there any areas in which various Asian countries might be looking at cooperation with China?
I think I should answer that, particularly given that just today, earlier today in Australia, we released the last next defence weapon. And Australia basically has a view that we have two very close friends. One, the United States, Washington, from the point of view of our security relationship, and a very different but very close relationship with China. And basically, we want the best of both worlds. And we make the point, therefore, that as a country we don't take sides in the South China Sea dispute. We will leave sure just how long personal view we're going to be able to sustain that idea, but at least that's still government policy as of a few hours ago with white paper's released. The reality is this is just hard to figure out what that line is between, certainly from Australia's point of view, but I would say from just about every other country in the region as well. Just talk about my own country. We have a very strong immigration from China. So we have, particularly in Sydney now, a very large Chinese population. And indeed, it's the second most common language in Australia now after English. So we're beginning to see the homogenisation of this region, actually, and that's a good indicator. And perhaps it will be through that homogenisation that in time we will start to see some of these tensions reduce as all sorts of other relationships start to become far more important than simply government.
Right. Just finally, the problem, even if you try to cooperate with China in the space domain, the ITAR is always been the sort of a big barriers to get along with. And many countries in APUSCO are not in the countries where they have the sort of association with the US-made parts to cooperate with China. And if we try to do that, somewhat this US export control, I think Mr. Borman may say something about this, but this has made a significant problem for the exchanging technologies, discussing about it, and of course, building the same, cooperative program. So this is why that even though countries that doesn't want to have the competition, eventually puts in the sort of boxes that they are in a sort of an outside of the cooperation scheme.
And it's even in areas arcane like space science. Australia, for example, has an over-the-horizon radar system which depends for its strengths and weaknesses on exquisite knowledge of the ionosphere. Well, the Chinese came to us a couple of years ago and said, would you like to be involved in the Meridian project, which is a really interesting project around space physics. And we said no, because we don't want to reveal what we do and don't know about the ionosphere, because straight away that tells you how good our damn radar is. Go figure.
Did you want to say anything about ITAR quickly before we break?
Well, you noticed that in answer to the question about the destinations for U.S. exports, China was not one of the countries mentioned. nor was Russia.
Nice one. All right, on that very diplomatic response, I think we'll close the panel. Please give a big round of applause to all the panelists.